World leaders have condemned the growing evidence of war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. Authorities are still trying to identify hundreds of victims of atrocities in the town of Bucha outside the capital, Kiev. As Russian forces withdraw from the north of the country, locals are coming out of hiding and taking stock after nearly a month under Russian occupation. DW's Nick Conley visited the small town of Bucha, which was in the middle of intense fighting between Russian and Ukrainian forces from late February. He spoke to residents struggling to make sense of what happened to them.
This is Bucha, a small town that's just emerging from a month under Russian occupation, a month in which it was on the front lines between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Toys, or sometimes just the words people or children. It's as much as many residents of this Ukrainian town could think of, a plea to the Russian troops to leave them and their families alone as they hid in their homes.
People in this village spent 27 days without water, 27 days without bread.
Volodymyr and his wife held out for 3 weeks until the shelling became too much to bear, and they were finally able to leave for a neighbouring village. When they got back, after the Ukrainian military had retaken the town, their home had been ransacked by retreating Russian troops.
They've gutted everything, carried everything out. All that's left are the walls and the sofas. They've taken all the electronics. I don't even know where they put it all. Over the month they were here, the Russians really changed for the worse. I'm just disgusted at the thought that they were moving around and eating in my house. At least they didn't sleep here. They just destroyed things for the sake of it.
But the impact on this community goes far beyond looted homes. Locals tell us they were kidnapped and detained in cellars for days on end, accused by the Russians of helping the Ukrainian military. Several residents are still missing, feared killed. A priest arrives from a neighbouring village with supplies for those who've lost almost everything. But it's not food or money that the locals are asking for.
The people here need tranquilizers. Many of them have lost everything that they spent a lifetime saving for. Their houses, their cars, it's all gone.
Lyubov shows us the damp cellar where she, her husband and her neighbours spent some of the coldest nights of the year.
We weren't just hearing the shelling, we could feel it. Everything was shaking. All we could do was pray that it wouldn't hit us. We just kept praying.
Supplies like these kept Lyubov and her husband going during the weeks under occupation, while the shop stayed shut and leaving home would have meant running a gauntlet.
By the time you've been up and down these steps a few times, you'll lose the will to do anything else.
Lyubov tells us she and everyone she knows is exhausted, always waiting for something they can't quite define, unable to ever let go.
We didn't used to understand what it was that people in Donbass have been going through all these years stuck in their cellars. The last month has taught us what war is.
For now, the Russian army has been pushed back more than 100 kilometers, but the fear they might return as suddenly as they appeared is never far away.
Our correspondent Nick Conley, who filed that report, joins us now from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Nick, you've now been to several towns surrounding Kiev in the wake of the Russian withdrawal there. You've interviewed numerous eyewitnesses. What have you pieced together about how Russian forces are fighting this war?
I think the overarching impression is one of chaos. So in that town where we just were, that we've seen the report, Bucha, locals told us that basically you had forces from all kinds of different regiments who were basically on the retreat, had sustained large losses in their first days in Ukraine and basically didn't know each other. So they had Russian soldiers that had no experience of interacting now suddenly grouped together again, having been surprised by that Ukrainian resistance, unable to make decisions, unable to really work out who was in charge, often undersupplied in terms of food, having to either ask the locals for food or just to take it, breaking into shops. That seems to be a picture we're seeing across the country, and not only shops but also into private homes. We've seen images now from Belarus, which is the kind of supply hub for lots of these Russian forces that were in northern Ukraine, of Russian soldiers in uniform going to post offices in Belarus, sending home huge packages of pretty obviously looted stuff from Ukraine, car batteries, electronics, even washing machines. That really seems to be a pretty widespread picture, and no sense that there's a lot of punishment from the kind of superiors, the highest up in the Russian army, if their subordinates do that. We did hear from locals, though, that it was a mixed picture. They had some positive interactions, some Russian soldiers who had admitted to them that they didn't want to be in Ukraine, that they had believed their superiors who told them that they were just going on exercise to the Ukrainian border, and that some had even apologized to them for the behavior of their fellow soldiers. In Bucha, the place of those mass killings that we've seen in recent days, one local told us that he had the impression that they were just scared. They had not really counted on meeting so much resistance from the Ukrainian army, and they basically saw any civilian out on the streets trying to get some food as a potential threat, as someone who might attack them. And so he said that the locals there, they really felt every time they left their homes that they were being watched through the sights of a Russian gun, that every time they left their houses they were likely to be shot. And it seems like most of the people who lost their lives in Bucha were indeed shot randomly on the streets by soldiers, often on tanks or other armoured vehicles, just taking pot shots at people with seemingly very little fear of any kind of accountability.
Nick, Russian forces have now pulled back from those areas around Kiev and are increasing pressure on the Donbas region in the east. The Ukrainian government is urging civilians to leave the east of the country. Are people heeding that call?
Well, there definitely are lots of trains heading west still, especially taking people who've got out of Mariupol by road, who then get to cities like Zaporizhia in the southeast and then make their journey west from there by train. But it doesn't seem like it is a mass exodus for now. And if the experience of the last few months need to go by, people on the whole tend to heed those kind of warnings only when it's too late, only when they can hear the fighting, the shelling close to them. Just in the weeks and months going into this war, there were all those warnings coming out of Washington, out of Western capitals, from Western intelligence authorities, and time again we went to places that were very vulnerable, that were on the border with Russia, with very little in the way of fortifications, and you'd ask people, are you worried? What is your contingency plan? And people would say, this is all bluff. This is just a political game by the Kremlin to put pressure on Ukraine. A full-scale war is unimaginable. The Russians wouldn't take those risks, and as such people just discounted it and would tell you they were actually more concerned about their job or the fact that their local shop was going to close down. So I think unfortunately lots of people, even though we're now in the second month of war, aren't really able to imagine the war arriving on their doorstep until it's too late.
Nick, thank you very much. Our correspondent Nick Connolly there in Kiev. And the mayor of Mariupol says more than 5,000 civilians have been killed there as Russia continues to lay siege to the port city.
This is what's left of Mariupol. Most of the residential buildings have been destroyed. Russian bombing and shelling has been relentless, forcing some residents to live in basements for weeks. Still, many are reluctant to leave. My husband says we will not leave Mariupol. We will stay until the end, whatever happens. He likes living here, he's a fisherman. He will not abandon Mariupol. Those who want to leave face a dangerous flight. The fragile ceasefire means those trying to reach civilians in the besieged city are also at risk.
Our team tried days and nights for 5 days to reach Mariupol under extremely difficult security conditions. We had to pass checkpoints. It was day and night operation, and relentlessly we tried to reach out, but unfortunately we did not manage to reach Mariupol because of the security conditions.
But the team did manage to drive civilians to safety more than 200 kilometers away. We decided to go with our child. Our family let us go with tears in their eyes. This is a long and dangerous journey. The nightmare of Mariupol is over for these families, but other civilians are still trapped there.
Today is World Health Day, and the World Health Organization says there have never been so many attacks on hospitals across the globe. This year alone has seen more than 130 health facilities targeted, the majority of them by Russian forces in Ukraine.
The moment a bomb exploded in the city of Mariupol. And this is what was hit. The maternity and children's hospital. Since the start of Russia's invasion, more than 90 health facilities, including hospitals like this one in the city of Izium, have been attacked, according to the World Health Organization. Some more than once. At the start of the war, the main hospital in the town of Volnovakha was hit. Days later, it was attacked again, and then again, while dozens of civilians were hiding inside, trying to escape the shelling. Among them was Andriy Kiadyanov, head of the hospital's trauma center, who was there with his wife and children. The experience still haunts him.
The shelling lasted about 20 to 25 minutes. Me and the kids. My children and I didn't make it to the basement. We spent all this time in the corridor of the hospital. We experienced all the shelling firsthand.
Pavlo Kovtonyuk is Ukraine's former deputy health minister. He now runs an organization that's trying to document each and every hospital attack.
Our main and primary goal is to help our country and help international community to hold accountable those people who would do those war crimes. And this is what really makes our team really motivated, because they feel that they're doing something very important for this war.
But as the war continues, so too do the attacks. Hopes of prosecutions seem a long way off.
Let's bring in Avril Benoit here. She's an emergency communications coordinator with Doctors Without Borders, and she joins me from Lviv in western Ukraine. Thanks for being with us. Avril, your organization has documented attacks on numerous hospitals and health facilities in Ukraine. Is there a pattern? Are hospitals being deliberately targeted, would you say?
It's very hard to know. The experience that our team had on Monday afternoon at about 3:30 local time in a residential area of Mykolaiv that had a high concentration of hospitals serving civilians is that it was a cluster bomb. They were there meeting some health authorities in the oncology hospital, just walking in when it started as a barrage that continued for roughly 10 minutes. And so are the hospitals targeted, or what would be the reason to be bombing a residential neighborhood that had a high concentration of hospitals? We would have to leave to others to verify that per se. I know that the World Health Organization has been doing this horrific tally of the number of health facilities that have been targeted, including ambulances, by the way. And so for us, it's just always the same concern and outrage that we express that medical facilities in times of war should be protected. They should be a place of sanctuary where people can go and feel safe, and that the health workers, the caretakers, and the patients, of course, can feel like this is going to be a protected space amid everything else that's going on.
Right. Now, Doctors Without Borders provides emergency medical aid. What's the situation for your colleagues trying to provide that aid in Ukraine?
It's an extremely challenging environment because there are many areas that do need humanitarian assistance, or the people would like to have the opportunity to flee, and it's just not possible. So encircled areas of Mariupol, certainly, but there are others. One of the challenges is that even for aid providers, whether it be the UN, the International Committee of the Red Cross, or independent NGOs like Doctors Without Borders or Médecins Sans Frontières, is that some of the roads are mined. So even if you think, okay, we're going to try and reach this area, it could be extremely perilous to bring the cargo in, the medical supplies in, that the hospitals inside those zones are crying for assistance, for some support. The other issue is just obstructions. There are checkpoints. There are officials saying, no, you can't go here. It's not safe. And so there are a number of obstacles to actually being able to be effectively in the places where people need us most.
Talking about getting into those difficult areas, does your organization have access, Avril, to those contested regions in the east of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk?
We do not, and that's one of the challenging things. We keep trying to be able to offer assistance based on independent assessments and an ability to deliver it directly ourselves. But what we are doing right now, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure since the Ukrainian government advised people yesterday to evacuate immediately a number of those areas, Donetsk, Luhansk, even Kharkiv, is that we are receiving a lot of calls for our medical referral train to come and pick up patients from hospitals that are overburdened in the east and take those patients, transport them or transfer them to hospitals that are better able to provide them a safe place to be able to be treated and recover. So that train activity, the medical referral train, is now under a lot of pressure with many, many requests and far too many for us to be able to safely transport, which is why we're developing a larger train that's kitted up with more equipment, more like an intensive care unit, to be able to assist greater numbers of people and make such a difference for the working flow of the hospital workload in the east.
Right. Avril, thank you very much for speaking with us. That was Avril Benoit from Doctors Without Borders speaking to us from Lviv in western Ukraine. NATO ministers are meeting in Brussels today to consider the Western alliance's response to the war in Ukraine amid worries that the conflict could drag on for months, if not years. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba is attending that meeting. Just a short while ago, he and NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg addressed reporters.
It is an urgent need to further support Ukraine. And at our meeting later on with the NATO foreign ministers, I'm certain that we will address the need for more air defense systems, anti-tank weapons, lighter but also heavier weapons, and many different types of support to Ukraine.
My agenda is very simple. It has only 3 items on it. It's weapons, weapons, and weapons. We are confident that the best way to help Ukraine now is to provide it with all necessary to contain Putin and to defeat Russian army in Ukraine.
Our correspondent Jack Perrick is covering that NATO meeting in Brussels. Jack, Ukraine wants weapons. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, says he expects NATO will deliver. So are the two sides on the same page?
Well, kind of, to be honest, Harry. It looks like Dmytro Kuleba is going to do a pretty impassioned plea to the NATO foreign ministers through these meetings. He said some really interesting things in this press conference. He pointed the finger directly at Berlin for not providing as many weapons as they wanted. He said Berlin has time, Kyiv doesn't, saying that the bureaucracy in Berlin to get weapons over the line and to be sending them to Ukraine is taking too long. He said that the decision by Germany to export weapons was a revolutionary step, but called on Germany specifically to do more. He also talked about the difference between defensive and offensive weapons, because that's some of the discussion around some of the NATO member states and also specifically in Germany. And Kuleba had to say that all weapons right now are defensive because they have been invaded by Russia, and there's no longer an offensive weapon. For them, they see offensive weapons simply as weapons that they need to use to push that invasion out. He also talked specifically about the sort of some of the thinking around this, because NATO members are slightly concerned about sending weapons to Ukraine for fear of being dragged into the war in a more broader sense. But what Kuleba had to say is, there's a simple deal from the Ukrainian side. Give us weapons, he said. We sacrifice our lives and we prevent the fallout from this war going out into other European countries. So it was a pretty specific set of demands he is here in Brussels to try and get weapons from the NATO allies.
NATO's Secretary General says we should be prepared for the long haul in Ukraine. Is that not an admission, Jack, that NATO's hands are effectively tied in this conflict?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it, Terry? I mean, there's this preparation now, I think, and Jens Stoltenberg has been talking over the last few weeks about this idea of the new normal, the troops that they've stationed in Eastern NATO member states that they're saying, need to, are probably likely going to be a more permanent position now if this war continues on and rumbles on. The question is, how does the NATO thinking shift on this? And I think actually what Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, said in response to what Kuleba was saying regarding German arms, she was talking about the sort of feelings that Europe has and the sort of sense of what's going on and what they need to try and do. And I think there are some shifts and some discussions happening within the German government, although she was relatively vague in her response to what Kuleba was saying with the demands for weapons.
Now, Jack, there's mounting evidence of war crimes being committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. Is this creating a greater sense of urgency among NATO and EU leaders there in Brussels?
I think definitely what we've seen over the last 7 days or so, there's been some pretty big statements coming out of EU leaders. We also know that the ambassadors of the European Union are sitting back down today to try and see if they can agree on this 5th round of EU sanctions, including an all-out ban on imports of Russian coal. We'll have to wait and see how that goes. It seems there is some stalling as well, but I think there is some impetus after those atrocities that we saw in Bucha.
Jack, thank you very much. Our correspondent Jack Perrick there in Brussels.